The ballroom glittered like a frozen lake beneath the flickering brilliance of 1,000 candles. Gilded mirrors reflected crystal chandeliers, each teardrop of light trembling with the weight of expectation. Guests in velvet coats and satin gowns glided across the polished parquet floor, their murmurs a symphony of judgment and curiosity. In that sea of refinement she stood alone, a trembling figure at the periphery, her pale blue gown a delicate ripple of silk that caught the glow of candlelight but could not shield her from the sharpness of whispered ridicule. At 19 she had been plucked from obscurity and thrust into the intricate machinery of high society, her hand claimed by an earl whose reputation carried both awe and apprehension. The disparity of their ages, her youth and his 45 winters, was a spectacle more curious than charming, and society had not failed to notice. Her name was Eleanor. She moved with the careful precision of one trained to appear composed, yet her fingers betrayed her, brushing nervously against the lace at her wrist. The Earl, her husband, stood near the far end of the hall, a tall and commanding figure in midnight coat and gleaming cravat. His presence was a study in restraint and authority, the kind that silenced chatter with the mere tilt of a head or the slow raise of a hand. Despite the crowds, his eyes often found hers, unwavering, watchful, protective, but never enough to bridge the chasm between her fragile confidence and the relentless scrutiny surrounding her. The first whisper struck her as a feather might, soft yet cutting. "She looks so unseasoned," said one dowager, her jeweled fan fluttering with judgment. "Too young to understand the life she has stepped into," murmured another, a lady with a lip that curled imperiously. Eleanor's cheeks burned, a bloom of shame that spread across her pale skin like wildfire. She had imagined entering society with grace, with the poised dignity demanded of an earl's wife, yet she was reduced to a subject of quiet mockery. Each step she took seemed heavier than the last, her gown a weight rather than a comfort, her heart hammering against the cage of her ribs as though it would escape and flee from the cruelty pressing in. A cluster of young women danced past her, their laughter crystalline and unthinking. Their eyes, curious or cruel, flicked toward her as they twirled. Eleanor lowered her gaze, noting the fine embroidery at her hem and the delicate pearls sewn into her bodice, each stitch meant to whisper refinement, yet each detail now seemed only to mark her as out of place. The orchestra swelled with a waltz that seemed to mock her, its lilting rhythm highlighting her awkward hesitation. She knew she ought to move with elegance, yet the confidence of youth was lost on her. She was a guest in a world that measured her worth by whispered commentary and sidelong glances. The Earl approached, his movements deliberate, a quiet command underlying each step. Eleanor could feel the weight of him before she saw him fully, a shadow folding itself around her. When he stopped beside her, the room seemed to exhale, the murmurs dimming as if acknowledging the inevitability of his authority. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice low but imbued with a subtle warmth that contrasted with the chill of public scrutiny. The question, simple as it was, felt like an offer of refuge, a lifeline cast across the turbulent waters of her humiliation. She nodded, scarcely daring to lift her hand. As he guided her into the center of the ballroom, the music seemed to shift, accommodating the two of them in a fragile bubble of temporary grace. Hands met lightly, his steady, hers trembling, and she felt a strange comfort in the pressure of his palm, a reminder that not all eyes were poised to judge. Yet the whispers continued, circling them like persistent ghosts. The Earl's folly? How long before society tires of her innocence? Eleanor felt the sting of each syllable as though it were a cold breeze brushing against exposed skin. Her heart quivered, torn between gratitude for his subtle shielding and despair at the world she had entered so unprepared. The Earl's gaze never faltered, and though his eyes were calm, there was a depth there that Eleanor could not fully read. In his presence, she sensed the complexities of a man who had witnessed both society's adoration and its cruelty, a man who understood the weight of reputation yet chose, in quiet defiance, to protect her. Every measured step in the waltz was a lesson in restraint, every glance a silent assertion that she was not to be entirely defined by the whispers surrounding her. A shiver of realization passed through her. This union, awkward in its beginnings, contained a layer of understanding that no social commentary could penetrate. The dance concluded, but the Earl's hand lingered for a moment longer than etiquette demanded. Eleanor's pulse had not yet returned to its steady rhythm, and she found herself caught between relief and lingering anxiety. A servant approached with a tray of delicate refreshments, but her hands were too uncertain to accept even a simple glass. She retreated a step, feeling the cool relief of distance from prying eyes, yet the warmth of his presence clung to her, an invisible shield against the daggers of polite society. A sudden, pointed laugh from across the room drew her attention. A man in a sharply cut coat raised a goblet, smirking, his words sharp enough to pierce without reaching her ears. Eleanor's stomach tightened, a wave of dread rolling through her. She realized with a bitter clarity that she was not merely married into a household, she was married into a battlefield where every gesture, every misstep, was fodder for judgment. She was young, unpracticed in the subtle arts of social survival, and the Earl, though a figure of safety, was bound by his own reputation, constrained by the formalities that governed even his most personal interactions. The ballroom, once glittering with promise, now pressed down upon her like a weight of crystal and gold. She drew herself toward the balcony at the far end of the room, her fingers brushing the cool brass railing. The night air greeted her like an old confidant, the scent of wet stone and garden roses mingling in a quiet reprieve from the stifling heat of judgment indoors. Below, the lights of the ballroom flickered like distant stars, and for the first time that evening, Eleanor allowed herself a long, shuddering breath. The world she had entered was merciless, yet within it existed moments of fragile grace, moments that required courage to seize, patience to endure. A shadow fell across her path. The Earl stepped onto the balcony, his presence as commanding in the open night as it had been among the murmurs and stares. He did not speak at first, allowing the sound of the garden and the distant music to fill the space. When he finally did, his words were soft, deliberate, carrying both authority and care. "Do not let them convince you that their whispers define you," he said. "Tonight and every night that follows, you are more than what they choose to see." Eleanor turned to meet his gaze, and for a moment, the weight of shame lifted, replaced by a tentative, trembling sense of possibility. The night stretched before them, heavy with unknown trials, yet marked by the faintest glimmer of protection and understanding. And in that glimmer, Eleanor glimpsed the quiet, fierce truth that her youth had not yet taught her. Dignity could endure even in the harshest of light. The morning after the grand ball arrived with the muted gray of a London winter, the city cloaked in fog that softened the edges of buildings and muffled the raucous gossip of the streets. Eleanor lingered at the drawing-room window, the lace curtains brushing her fingertips as though seeking reassurance she could not yet summon. The events of the previous evening haunted her like a persistent echo. The laughter, the whispers, the weight of eyes that measured her as if she were an object rather than a woman newly wed. She had glimpsed a fragment of comfort in the Earl's steadiness, but that fragment seemed fragile, too delicate to withstand the scrutiny that awaited her in the daylight. Outside, carriages rumbled over cobblestones, their wheels echoing through the fog, a reminder that the world beyond her temporary sanctuary would not pause for her unease. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. The Earl entered, his coat still brushed with the scent of rain from his early morning ride. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the room before resting on her with a quiet intensity. "You were quite resolute last night," he remarked, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable note of admiration. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, unsure whether to meet his gaze or lower her eyes, the remnants of her embarrassment still clinging like dew to her shoulders. She began, faltering, "I only tried to remain composed." The Earl's expression softened, though his posture remained upright, a sentinel of propriety. "Composure is not always demanded by the world, Eleanor. Courage often suffices." The words, carefully measured, resonated with a warmth she had not expected, an acknowledgment of her trials that no one else had granted. Yet even in that quiet room society's intrusion proved relentless. A footman arrived, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with a ribbon, the handwriting on the tag unfamiliar and elegant. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she untied it, revealing a delicate locket nestled upon a bed of velvet. The gold caught the light from the fireplace, gleaming with quiet promise. Inside the locket, 2 miniature portraits stared back. One of the Earl, painted with such care that his eyes seemed almost alive, and another blank, a canvas awaiting her likeness. Eleanor's breath caught. It was a gesture of intimacy, a subtle assertion of ownership, yet offered without fanfare, a secret shield against the scrutiny that would inevitably follow her. Her gaze lifted to the Earl, whose hand hovered near hers, hesitant yet patient. "Consider it a reminder," he murmured, "that not all eyes are meant to judge. Some see only what matters." The gift brought a measure of solace, yet it could not erase the sting of rumor that had already begun to stir. A servant whispered of letters that had been circulated in society's salons, hints of impropriety insinuated into the ink of gossip. One missive, scandalous and precise, suggested that the Earl's attentions were a folly, a fleeting indulgence that would soon be discarded. Eleanor felt a chill creep along her spine, a shiver born of fear and indignation. She had been warned of society's cruelty, but the immediacy of it, the way it sought to gnaw at her dignity even in the sanctuary of her own home, left her unmoored. The Earl observed her reaction with calm scrutiny, recognizing in her flushed cheeks and downcast eyes the struggle between pride and vulnerability. "Let them whisper," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Words hold no dominion over the bond we choose to cultivate in silence." Eleanor clung to that sentiment, yet the weight of external judgment pressed insistently, demanding she learn the art of resilience far sooner than she had imagined. Days passed, and with them came the subtle escalation of societal challenge. Invitations arrived, each one a test of composure. Teas with formidable dowagers, luncheons with scrutinizing matrons, even brief encounters in hallways where eyes lingered too long and words were weighed with double meanings. Eleanor's steps grew more measured, her posture more deliberate, each gesture honed to withstand the invisible gauntlet of observation. Yet even as she navigated these trials, the Earl's presence remained a counterbalance, an unseen arm shielding her from the full force of ridicule. He offered no ostentation, no grand declarations in these moments. Instead, he moved quietly beside her, his subtle attentions a whisper of reassurance that she could interpret only in private glances or the brush of a hand against her own. One afternoon, a scandal arrived not in whispers but in audacious display. A visiting lord, known for his sharp tongue and cruel amusement, approached Eleanor during a gathering in the Earl's library. He praised her youth in tones laced with mockery, hinting that her naivety rendered her ill-suited for the responsibilities of her position. Eleanor's pulse quickened, her chest constricted with the twin forces of indignation and embarrassment. The Earl's response was measured yet devastating in its authority. He stepped forward, placing a hand lightly upon her shoulder, his voice smooth and resonant. "Miss Eleanor carries herself with a grace that surpasses your understanding, sir. It is wisdom to observe rather than to presume." The Lord's smirk faltered, and Eleanor felt the tremor of vindication, a flicker of pride igniting amid the lingering embarrassment. In the quiet that followed, the Earl guided her toward the window, the afternoon light falling upon the room in muted gold. "Society tests us not to humiliate but to temper," he said, his eyes locking with hers, the depth of his gaze insisting she meet it fully. Eleanor's lips parted in hesitant acknowledgement, realizing that these trials, painful as they were, contained the lessons her youth had never afforded her: patience, dignity, and the subtle power of endurance. Each whispered insult, each sideways glance, became less a wound and more a challenge to be met with poise. She understood now that her marriage was not merely a union of convenience or title, but a crucible in which her character would be forged, sharpened by the subtle forces of judgment and expectation. Even as the lesson sank in, another gesture reminded her that intimacy could flourish quietly amid scrutiny. The Earl produced a small, folded note, its edges worn as if carried close to his person for days. Eleanor unfolded it with care, revealing a simple phrase penned in his precise hand: "You are not alone, not while I can prevent it." The words, unassuming yet potent, pressed upon her heart with warmth and insistence. The room seemed to contract, the golden light of the afternoon intensifying the gravity of the sentiment. Eleanor felt a delicate tremor of courage stir within her, a recognition that her dignity, though fragile, was not beyond protection, and that her position in the world, however precarious, was not entirely at the mercy of idle gossip. As evening fell, Eleanor retreated to the garden once more, the fog from the morning now replaced by the crisp clarity of starlight. Her gown brushed against the dew-laden grass, a soft whisper of silk and perseverance. She contemplated the events of the day, the subtle affronts, the moments of defense, and the quiet gestures that promised private solidarity. The Earl appeared beside her without announcement, as though summoned by the weight of her thoughts. He offered no grand declarations, only the steady presence that had become a lifeline in a sea of judgment. Eleanor met his gaze, sensing in it both the challenge of society and the quiet promise of protection. And as the cool night pressed upon them, mingling with the scent of roses and wet earth, she realized that her trials were far from concluded, and that in the delicate balance between shame and courage, between public scorn and private devotion, the contours of her new life were being drawn with meticulous, unyielding hands. The library was hushed, suffused with the gentle amber glow of the fireplace, each flame casting long, quivering shadows across the rows of leather-bound tomes. Eleanor lingered near a tall window, the evening wind rattling the panes with a soft insistence, carrying the scent of wet cobblestones and frostbitten roses from the gardens below. She had spent the day enduring the subtle machinations of society, each whispered critique and patronizing glance pressing upon her resolve, Yet here, in the quiet sanctity of the Earl's private chamber, the weight of expectation seemed to lift, replaced by a tremulous hope she scarcely dared acknowledge. She traced her fingers along the spines of books, feeling the grain of the leather and the delicate impressions of gilt lettering, as though the solidity of knowledge might anchor her to something enduring amid the caprice of rumor and judgment. The Earl entered without ceremony, his boots soft against the polished floor, the scent of his coat mingling faintly with tobacco and cedarwood. He regarded her with that steady, unreadable gaze, one that had, over weeks, begun to offer comfort even in its restraint. "You are restless," he observed, his voice low and measured, carrying a tone that was equal parts inquiry and quiet command. Eleanor turned to meet him, her lips parting as though to protest, yet the words lodged in her throat. Restless, yes, and yet not merely from fatigue. She carried the invisible bruises of the day, the sideways glances, the carefully veiled ridicule, the feeling of being perpetually observed and judged. She had learned that society's scrutiny could wound without ever raising its voice, leaving marks that were invisible yet no less real. The Earl moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away, the firelight tracing angles of his face with harsh clarity. "You need not endure this alone," he said, placing a hand lightly on the corner of a table, close enough that his presence was tangible, yet not so near as to startle. Eleanor's breath caught. There was a sincerity in his tone, a deliberate absence of pretense, that seemed to disarm the careful defenses she had constructed in the public sphere. For months, she had measured her every glance, her every gesture, in a silent calculus of propriety, yet here she was, allowed a vulnerability that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She wished to speak, yet the words that hovered upon her lips were fragile, unshaped, mere wisps of thought struggling against the weight of her own uncertainty. Finally she found her voice, timid yet resolute. I do not know how to navigate their eyes, to survive their scrutiny. I fear that every misstep will echo longer than my own heart can bear." The Earl regarded her with the patience of one accustomed to the careful unfolding of human complexity. "It is not your missteps that define you," he said, his words deliberate and measured. "It is how you rise from them, how you carry yourself in their wake. Courage, once understood, is often more compelling than beauty, more enduring than youth." Eleanor felt a shiver of understanding ripple through her, the truth of his observation pressing gently upon her chest, offering both relief and the daunting weight of expectation. Courage, a currency she had scarcely possessed in public, yet one that now seemed attainable under his quiet guidance. He gestured toward a small writing desk, its surface cluttered with letters, papers, and a solitary inkpot. "There is a freedom in expression," he said, "in recording what the world cannot see or judge. Let your thoughts be preserved, if only for yourself." Eleanor approached, her hands brushing against the polished surface, feeling the warmth of the wood and the faint scent of parchment. She selected a sheet, noting the crispness of the paper beneath her fingers, the potential of the blank page a mirror of the possibility that lay before her. Words, she realized, could offer a refuge from the relentless demands of propriety, a means to articulate the truths her lips dared not speak. The Earl remained near, yet allowed her a space that was at once protective and liberating. "There are truths unspoken in every household, Eleanor," he continued. "Secrets that society presumes to know, yet cannot touch, cannot diminish. Do you trust me to hear yours?" Her heart thudded, a tumultuous rhythm that mirrored the quiet urgency of the wind outside. To speak would be to expose herself, to offer a fragment of herself into the care of another, yet the steadiness of his gaze, the measured weight of his hand resting lightly on the desk, invited that exposure with gentle insistence. Eleanor nodded, and in that small, deliberate motion, she relinquished a measure of fear to hope. I am often overwhelmed by the constant judgment," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of long-repressed anxiety. "I wish to be the wife they expect, the lady they deem suitable, yet I feel perpetually unworthy of even the smallest acknowledgement." The Earl's eyes softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them, the faintest acknowledgement of shared understanding. He reached into his coat, producing a small, folded piece of parchment, worn at the edges as though carried close to his person for some time. "Then let this remind you," he said, placing it gently before her. "It is not their expectations that matter, but the measure of your own heart, and the regard of those who truly see it." Eleanor unfolded the note to find a few simple words penned in his exacting hand. "Your dignity is your own. Preserve it fiercely." The sentiment, unadorned yet profound, struck her with the force of revelation. She realized in that instant that protection need not always come in spectacle. It could reside in quiet, deliberate gestures that reinforced both courage and self-worth. The firelight danced across the floor as she considered his words, her mind turning over the lessons of weeks spent under scrutiny, of moments both humiliating and tender. She felt the stirrings of resolve, a nascent strength that had been nurtured under his quiet watchfulness, a knowledge that dignity could survive even amidst society's most cutting remarks. And yet, the recognition of her vulnerability remained, a delicate tension between the exhilaration of emerging confidence and the lingering fear of exposure. She had come to understand in small, careful increments that the Earl's attentions were not mere indulgence, but a deliberate cultivation of trust, an unspoken covenant in a world that prized appearances above truth. The wind rose again, rattling the panes with renewed insistence, as if echoing the unsettled state of Eleanor's own thoughts. She looked to the Earl, who remained a steadfast presence, the calm center in the maelstrom of expectation and judgment. "I must learn," she whispered, "to reconcile who I am with who they expect me to be." His gaze held hers, unwavering and patient, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement. "And you shall," he said quietly. "But remember, it is not their understanding you require. It is your own." Eleanor felt a tremor of gratitude, of recognition, that perhaps, within these quiet moments, she could claim the agency denied her in the public sphere, could cultivate a strength invisible to those who measured only surface impressions. A distant knock at the door interrupted the fragile equilibrium, a reminder that the world beyond this sanctuary would not pause for reflection. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The lessons of courage, of dignity, of quiet resilience, were soon to be tested once more. The Earl, noting her apprehension, offered no immediate solace, only the subtle assurance of proximity. She drew in a breath, steeling herself for the intrusion, aware that the evening promised revelations that could either fortify or undo the fragile confidence she had begun to cultivate. The room, suffused with firelight and shadow, seemed suddenly vast, holding both possibility and threat in equal measure. And in that tension, Eleanor realized that the path forward would demand not only courage, but an intimacy of trust she had never before experienced. A lesson in the heart's quiet strength and the delicate power of confessions shared in shadowed rooms. The grand ballroom shimmered once more, but tonight it bore a different weight. Crystal chandeliers hung like captured constellations, reflecting light upon gilded moldings and polished parquet floors, yet the brilliance of the room did little to ease Eleanor's heartbeat. She had rehearsed composure countless times in her mind, practicing measured steps, the angle of her chin, the careful modulation of her voice. Tonight was not merely another gathering, it was the stage upon which whispers could be silenced or magnified, where the scrutiny that had hounded her since her marriage would either bow to her poise or crush it entirely. Her gown, a soft blush of silk adorned with delicate lace, clung to her figure with elegance, and the pearls at her throat glimmered with quiet defiance. Yet beneath the refined surface, a tremor of uncertainty lingered, a fragile tension between fear and the burgeoning courage she had learned to nurture. The Earl arrived at her side with that same deliberate calm, the scent of cedarwood and faint tobacco marking his presence. His eyes, dark and unwavering, met hers for a moment, conveying a promise she could scarcely articulate. He would remain her shield and her partner, no matter the judgment that pressed upon them. Together they entered the ballroom, the orchestra swelling to meet their passage. Heads turned, murmurs rippled through the crowd like the soft lapping of water against stone. Some eyes bore curiosity, others scorn. Eleanor felt each gaze as a tangible weight, yet the Earl's hand, resting lightly on her elbow, reminded her that she was not without support. The ballroom, once an arena of fear, began to feel like a stage upon which she might claim her own dignity, not merely endure it. Their first encounter was with the Viscountess of Belmore, whose fan snapped open with a crisp flourish, her eyes alight with both calculation and amusement. "How fortuitous," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp, "that the Earl's young bride is present tonight. One wonders if her steps will match the elegance of the company." Eleanor inclined her head, lips parting in a practiced, polite smile. The words stung, yet she met them with measured calm. The Earl's gaze met hers, a subtle reassurance that her composure was sufficient, that appearances could hold meaning even when society sought to diminish them. She began to realize that courage was not merely the absence of fear, but the act of standing steady in its presence. A sudden movement drew the attention of the assembly. The orchestra signaled the beginning of a waltz, and the Earl extended his hand to Eleanor. Hearts around the room seemed to pause, as if aware that the act of dancing could carry significance beyond its rhythm. She placed her hand in his, feeling the firm, steady pressure, and allowed herself to be led into the center of the ballroom. The music wove around them, a tapestry of strings and woodwinds, and in that moment the collective gaze of society seemed both oppressive and irrelevant. Step by step, turn by turn, Eleanor felt a growing awareness of her own agency. Her movements, once hesitant, became deliberate, confident, small revolutions disguised in the language of propriety. As the dance continued, whispers erupted anew, but this time Eleanor perceived them differently. A lady with a sharp tongue murmured of youth and folly, a gentleman speculated on the Earl's motivations. Yet Eleanor no longer trembled. The Earl's hand never wavered, his eyes never left hers, and she sensed the subtle protection in every measured gesture. Each pirouette became a quiet assertion. She was not merely an ornament to be scrutinized, but a woman who could navigate the delicate balance of scrutiny and self-possession. Her chest swelled with an unfamiliar mixture of pride and exhilaration. The power of dignity, even amid the judgments of the powerful, was intoxicating. The music softened, and the Earl lowered her hand, drawing her close in a motion that was both public and intimate. "You move with remarkable grace," he murmured, his lips close to her ear, the words audible only to her. Eleanor's pulse quickened, not from vanity, but from the acknowledgement that she was seen, not by society, but by the man whose regard mattered most. In that fleeting intimacy she recognized the transformation within herself. Fear had begun to yield to confidence, doubt to self-possession, and the fragile bloom of courage was flowering within her. A sudden interjection drew their attention. A visiting lord, notorious for his wit and cruelty, approached with a smirk that bespoke ridicule. "I trust the Earl's young wife does not tire of these long dances?" he asked, voice sharp enough to pierce polite ears. Eleanor's initial instinct was to shrink, to falter under the weight of his implication, but she felt the Earl's hand, steady and unwavering, at her elbow. His gaze met hers, conveying a silent command, "Meet him without fear." Eleanor straightened, her voice clear yet soft. "I find the evening most enlightening." The lord faltered, his smirk replaced by a twitch of surprise, and a ripple of quiet satisfaction passed through her. The subtle victory was hers, an assertion of presence in a world that had sought to reduce her to object and ornament. The Earl's hand lingered briefly at her back as they continued across the floor, guiding without dominance, protective yet unobtrusive. Eleanor felt a warmth rise within her, a mixture of relief and pride, the recognition that she could occupy her space in the world with dignity. The whispers, the glances, the speculative chatter, all were no longer weights to crush her spirit, but markers of a stage upon which she could claim her own authority. The dance ended, and as the music waned, Eleanor realized she was no longer merely a participant in society's game, but a contender in it, capable of subtle triumphs in the quietest of gestures. The evening pressed on, and the Earl led her to the edge of the ballroom, where the air was cooler and the murmur of society softened to a distant hum. He produced a small, folded note from within his coat, and Eleanor unfolded it with cautious anticipation. The words were few, but they struck her with the force of conviction. "Tonight, you have begun to command the world's regard. Continue to move with both courage and discretion. They will soon see the strength within you." Eleanor's lips curved in a subtle, private smile, the mixture of affirmation and challenge igniting a new spark of determination. She understood now that her journey was far from complete, yet the path ahead, while fraught with scrutiny, was navigable with careful grace and unwavering resolve. The night air from the open windows swept over her, carrying the scent of roses and frost, mingling with the fading strains of music. Eleanor's gaze fell upon the glittering faces of the ballroom, some curious, some critical, yet none capable of undoing the quiet triumph she had claimed in her own stead. The Earl remained close, a steady presence, his dark eyes holding the unspoken promise of continued guidance and protection. She drew a breath, feeling the tension of the evening relax in her shoulders, yet aware that challenges still loomed, whispers that had not yet been silenced, intrigues that had not yet been fully tested. And in that suspended moment, Eleanor realized that the dance of appearances and intentions was far from over, that every gesture, every word, every measured smile was a step in a larger pattern of negotiation and power. Yet for the first time she sensed a reservoir of strength within herself, a recognition that the Earl's quiet guidance had begun to transform fear into agency, doubt into determination, and humiliation into resilience. The ballroom, once a theater of judgment, had become the proving ground for her emerging self, and the Earl, both partner and protector, had shown her the subtle, enduring power of recognition and shared resolve. As they stepped toward the gallery overlooking the gardens, Eleanor caught a movement in the shadows, a figure observing them, intent and unreadable. The thrill of triumph mingled with the cold shiver of foreboding, and she knew with sudden clarity that society's gaze, while momentarily appeased, had not abandoned its scrutiny. The night promised revelations yet to come, and the fragile balance between public acknowledgement and private understanding remained perilously poised. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the Earl's, seeking reassurance in the familiar warmth, and in that touch she understood that the journey was only beginning, and that the most testing moments were yet to arrive. The night had fallen with a hush over the estate, the gardens draped in silver moonlight, frost glimmering upon the trimmed hedges like scattered diamonds. The ballroom windows reflected the dim glow of lanterns, and through them, Eleanor observed the guests moving like shadows in a world that had once seemed insurmountable. Tonight was no ordinary gathering. Whispers had intensified through the week, fueled by jealous eyes and idle tongues, and Eleanor knew that every gesture, every measured smile, would be scrutinized with ruthless attention. Yet, as she adjusted the lace at her wrist and felt the familiar press of pearls at her throat, a steady calm settled over her, a resilience honed by weeks of scrutiny, guidance, and quiet triumphs. She was no longer the trembling girl who had first entered the Earl's household. She was a woman tempered by trial, armed with dignity, and aware of the subtle power that came from quiet confidence. The Earl approached, his dark eyes catching hers with an intensity that both reassured and unsettled. "Shall we?" he asked, offering a hand that spoke of partnership and protective command. Eleanor placed hers within his, feeling the steady warmth that had become her anchor. As they entered the ballroom, a subtle hush fell over the assembly, as if the world itself paused to acknowledge the union of grace and authority that now moved among them. Each head turned, some with curiosity, others with critical calculation, yet none could diminish the quiet claim of self-possession that Eleanor now wielded like armor. The orchestra began a soft prelude, and the Earl guided her to the center of the room, their movements deliberate and elegant. The eyes of the crowd followed, some eager to witness humiliation, others perhaps intrigued by her growing poise. Eleanor met their gaze with measured composure, the lessons of previous nights etched into every gesture. The whispers that once tormented her seemed to dissolve, replaced by a tension that was no longer fear but expectation. She felt the subtle thrill of command, the knowledge that she could occupy space, move with grace, and demand attention without demanding it aloud. Every tilt of her chin, every step in time with the music, was a quiet defiance against the world that had sought to define her solely by her youth and the discrepancy of her marriage. Then, as if the universe had conspired to test her resolve, the Viscountess of Belmore approached, her fan snapping open with the sharp precision of accusation. "I hear the Earl's young bride has grown quite confident in a single week," she said, her tone laced with amusement and condescension. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a familiar mixture of anxiety and determination. She recalled the quiet guidance of the Earl, the whispered lessons of patience and subtle authority, and she drew herself erect. "Confidence," she replied, her voice soft yet clear, "is learned in the company of understanding, not in the approval of idle speculation." The words were simple, but their precision and quiet defiance drew a murmur of surprise. The Viscountess's smile faltered, and Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction, subtle yet intoxicating. For the first time she sensed the balance of power shifting, not through overt confrontation but through grace and restraint. The Earl's hand brushed hers as they moved into a waltz, the music swelling around them, the notes weaving a delicate tapestry of tension and triumph. Eleanor's steps were steady, her posture impeccable, her gaze unflinching even as eyes followed them with curiosity. She felt the thrill of mastery, the realization that her presence alone, combined with the protective subtlety of the Earl, could command attention and respect. Every measured turn, every poised step became a declaration. She was not merely a pawn in society's game, but an active participant, capable of navigating its intrigues with quiet strength. Amid the swirl of silk and candlelight, a figure emerged at the periphery, Lord Ashcombe, whose whispered criticisms had shadowed Eleanor since her arrival. He stepped forward, offering the faintest smile, a challenge wrapped in civility. "It is remarkable," he said, "that youth and experience may coexist in such harmony." Eleanor met his gaze without faltering, her pulse steady. "Harmony," she replied, "is born of understanding, not presumption." The Earl's dark eyes glimmered with quiet approval. He inclined his head ever so slightly, an acknowledgement that her growth had not gone unnoticed. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension of observation thick enough to touch, yet Eleanor felt the exhilaration of triumph coursing through her veins. She had transformed whispers of ridicule into acknowledgments of composure, and in that quiet victory she discovered a new dimension of her own power. As the final strains of the waltz faded, Eleanor felt the Earl's hand settle at the small of her back, a protective, intimate gesture visible to all yet unassuming. "You have done well tonight," he murmured, his voice a low caress against her ear. "Better than I could have expected." Eleanor's chest rose and fell with the weight of pride, tempered by the humility of understanding. She realized that triumph was not measured by the absence of challenge, but by the mastery of one's own responses in the presence of it. She had survived scrutiny, navigated whispers, and maintained her dignity. Tonight she had moved from shadow into quiet, undeniable light. The assembly shifted, murmurs rippling anew, but now tinged with awe rather than scorn. A hush fell over the room as the Earl stepped slightly forward, his presence commanding attention without raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone steady and authoritative, "the lady before you has endured what few could, and yet she carries herself with a grace that commands both admiration and respect. Eleanor is not merely my wife, she is a woman of discernment, courage, and poise. Let her presence remind us that strength may come in unexpected forms." The declaration, quiet yet firm, sent a ripple through the crowd. Eyes widened, whispers stilled, and for the first time, Eleanor felt that society's judgment had been transformed into acknowledgement, if not admiration. She met the Earl's gaze, her lips curving in a subtle, private smile. The validation was not external alone, it had been internalized, a quiet, fierce affirmation of her own worth. The night, however, was far from complete. A shadow lingered near the gallery, a figure observing with intent and unreadable expression. Eleanor felt the familiar shiver of foreboding, yet it was tempered now by confidence. She had learned to measure fear, to navigate uncertainty, and to draw strength from the presence of one who understood both society's cruelty and the protection of shared trust. The Earl's hand brushed hers once more, a reminder that she was not alone in this delicate dance of observation and subtle power. Together they moved toward the garden, the moonlight casting long reflections upon frost-kissed hedges, the air crisp with the scent of roses and night-blooming jasmine. In the quiet of the garden, Eleanor allowed herself to exhale, the tension of weeks compressed into a single, satisfying release. The Earl stood beside her, dark and imposing, yet his presence conveyed more than authority. It spoke of partnership, of respect, and of a shared understanding that society's scrutiny could not undo the bond they had cultivated. "You have learned much," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of admiration and subtle pride. Eleanor turned to him, eyes wide yet steady, and nodded. "And I have learned that courage, dignity, and quiet assertion carry more power than I ever imagined." Their fingers intertwined, a gesture both private and profound, signaling the completion of one trial and the anticipation of those yet to come. From the shadows of the gallery, the observing figure retreated, the threat muted yet unresolved, a reminder that the path of triumph was never entirely free of challenge. Eleanor felt the shiver of anticipation, tempered by the warmth of accomplishment. She had transformed fear into poise, whispers into affirmation, and humiliation into resilience. The night air carried the promise of new understanding, of future negotiations in a world where appearances weighed heavily yet could be mastered with patience and strength. The moonlight glimmered across the frost, a mirror of the quiet, enduring power Eleanor had claimed within herself, and she knew that the trials of society would persist, but she was no longer the trembling girl at the edge of judgment. She was Eleanor, composed, courageous, and quietly victorious. And as the Earl drew her closer beneath the silver glow of the moon, whispering words that mingled intimacy with unspoken protection, Eleanor felt the culmination of her journey, the mastery of self in a world that sought to define her. The ballroom, the whispers, the scrutiny, all faded into a distant echo, leaving only the certainty of mutual respect, quiet love, and the unshakable strength that had been forged in the crucible of society's gaze. Yet in that triumph, Eleanor sensed the delicate truth that life would continue to challenge her, that shadows of doubt and intrigue would return. But for now she had discovered the lesson that youth could never teach, that dignity, courage, and shared understanding could transform even the harshest judgment into a stage for quiet, undeniable victory.